Our next keynote speaker, everybody ready, is here to talk about the new economic drivers and outlook in Asia for 2024. Please welcome the Director of Southeast Asia from the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network, Sumana Rajarethnam.
Morning, everyone. Good to see some energy in the room. I'm going to start with a story of a taxi driver. So it was about 2 years ago, just coming out of COVID. I was going for my first trip post-COVID. I was very excited. I was going to Kuala Lumpur. I live in Singapore. I got into the taxi. Taxi driver turns around to me and he says, do you mind, can I ask you, what do you do for a living? So I told him, I'm an economist. I go around, I tell people about geoeconomics, about the business environment, about politics. I was very impressed with myself. I thought the taxi driver would be impressed as well. But he turns around and he says, oh, you guys get things wrong all the time. You tell me that Trump is going to lose, he wins. You tell me that China is going to crash, it's still there. You tell me that, inflation is coming down, I still can't afford a chicken in the market. And I learned one thing that day, which was that I was very glad that I live quite close to the airport. So what I'm going to do today is take you through some short-term economic trends, some medium-term ones, and then some things to look for in 2024. And I asked you to channel your inner taxi driver with some skepticism, and hopefully that leads you to some new ideas as well. So here's our map of global growth in 2024. So this is a map of the world. Each of the hexagons represents a country. So you can see North America on your left, and you can see the region that we are sitting in Asia, on your right. And it's a heat map, so the more yellow or red it is, the higher the growth. And the more tepid colors, light blue or blue, lower growth. So you can see in the US, in North America, lots of those blues and greens. We only expect the US to grow at around 1% next year. It also is an election year. So growth is not going to be great there. The US did surprise us a bit this year, but it's going to come down next year. In Europe, you can see lots of those blue and green colors, so a lot of tepid colors there. It is going to grow a bit higher than it did this year, but this year was really not a great year for the EU, so a bit of a bounce effect there. And then, you can see that I've put the war in Ukraine drags on with little peace or prospect of peace negotiations. At some point, hopefully, I'll be able to take that off. But our view at The Economist is that the war in Ukraine will last for another 5 years. And what that does is that it means that sanctions will remain, and that puts a bit of grit into the global economy, and so slows things down just a little bit. But look at our region, and that's where you see lots of reds, lots of yellows, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, Thailand, all growing at a pretty good clip. So just from a visual perspective, you can see that most of the growth that we're going to get from the world is going to come from our region. China there, you can see that it is a much better year. China had grown at only 3% last year, so this next year is going to be much better. But China is starting to slow down, and we'll talk about that. But let me put some of these numbers into context, right? So we forecast growth of around 2.2 to 2.4% next year. That will pretty much feel like how it did this year, right? So that was what the global economy grew this year. Over the last 20 years, growth has only been below 2% twice. Once was during the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and the other one was the first year of COVID, right? So when I say unspectacular, I think that's really justified. The other thing is to look at where that growth is coming from. So of that 2.4%, about 30% will come from China. So China, even though it's slowing down, is a very important part of the global economy, and of course contributes about 60% of growth in Asia. And the US and the EU combined will only contribute about 20% to that 2.4% figure. So just to give you some relative comparisons to see where we are. So talking a little bit about the US, we can talk about two things. One is consumer sentiment. So looking at that graph on the left there, consumer sentiment is in red. So you can see that slightly ticking upwards after coming down during COVID. And then inflation, right? So inflation is the line in blue, and you can see that inflation is coming down as well. Never underwrite the US consumer. We underestimated them this year, but they did very well, spent a lot of money. US growth came in at about 1.8%, which is much higher than our initial forecasts at the beginning of this year. But they are running out of money, right? So they're running out of their accumulated savings from COVID. A lot of those government handouts are now gone. Credit card debt is about 16% higher than it was a year ago. So the US consumer, with those high interest rates and even though inflation is moderating, costs are still high, they will suffer a little bit. And so that's why we think that growth will come down to about 0.9% in the US this year. On top of that, there's the Inflation Reduction Act, which I want to touch upon a few more times, but that is producing some manufacturing output in the US, and that also kind of steadies the US economy to a certain extent, and that's why we don't think that there will be a recession or a hard landing in the US. Now, China, it is a very big economy. We think it will grow about 5.5% this year. Next year, sort of just below 4%, just below 5%, and then it'll start to slow down, right? China's economy is huge and it's maturing, and those days where it grew at 7-8% are kind of far behind us. But it is a massive, massive economy. What I have here is FDI inflows into China from 2016, so before the pandemic, and then forecast out to 2028. So you can see that during the years of the pandemic in 2021, when China was open and the rest of the world was closed, that FDI came in very high, and then it started to come down, and it's very, very low this year, and it will recover a little bit, but probably just below the pandemic levels. Over the last 4 quarters, about $100 billion a quarter of portfolio money has come out of China. So that gives you a snapshot of what investor confidence is in China at the moment. Several issues, I'm sure a lot of you know about the property sector and how that is dragging on growth. There's also high youth unemployment. And China is trying to shift from a more export-oriented economy to be more consumer demand-focused. That shift will take a long time, and a lot of things need to be done. But one kind of challenging sign is that over the last few weeks, we've seen consumer debt in China increase. So about 8 million people have been put on a blacklist because they have not paid their mortgages or some kind of loans. And so you can see for China to make this switch from an export-oriented economy to a consumer-driven economy is going to be a challenging one. So by the end of this decade, by 2030, we think that China will probably be growing at around 3 or 3.5%, but that is still massive. A Chinese economy growing at 2.5% essentially adds the whole of the Indian economy. So that's how big the Chinese economy is. It's very, very important for the region. Of course, some sectors are doing very well in China. EV is one of them. They are pushed towards the green transition. A lot of those companies are doing very well as well, but not enough to kind of shift or take up the shortfall for the property sector. Now, this is our map of Asia, and what I've put here is GDP in 2023 is that blue line, and then 2024 is the red line, and so you want to move from blue to red. And what the story I want to tell here is that most of this is better growth next year for countries in the region. The Philippines growing better, Vietnam better, Indonesia slightly better as well. So, in Southeast Asia and in Asia Pacific, by and large, growth has been consistent over the past 3 years and will be consistent for the next 3 years as well. So we do see continued growth here. It will soften just a little bit overall from about 4% as a region to about 3.9%, but still a good growth engine for the world. Now, we will talk a little bit about Inflation, because it has been such a big issue over the past 3 years. Inflation last year globally was about 9%, this year 7%. Next year we are looking at around 4.5% overall. So inflation is coming down, and you can see that from that graph on the top left. The light blue line is emerging economies, so you can see how that line is coming down, but still rather elevated from before the pandemic. And then the dark blue line is developed economies, and so you can see that's coming down and sort of flattening out at around 2% from 2025 onwards, right? So developed economies, inflation will come down. Emerging economies, they are coming down, but they are a bit more sticky, but prices are still elevated. Prices are still high. So that is one of the things to look out for when it comes to affordability, especially consumers and producer prices as well. We have mostly upside risks to inflation. The war between Israel and Hamas might push hydrocarbon prices higher. If you get a very bad El Nino effect, that might push food prices higher as well. So most of our risks to inflation are on the upside. And then on that graph below is interest rates. So the story there is really most countries, especially countries in Southeast Asia, look at the US Fed and what the Fed rate is. And essentially, even though it's higher for longer, it has stabilized. So you can see that blue line there is straight for a long time. And we do expect it to start coming down by the middle or third quarter of 2024. And once that comes down, most of the central banks in Southeast Asia will be able to follow suit. And what that means is that it's pretty good news for currencies in the region, right? So here is how the US dollar compares to a bunch of different Asian currencies. And you can see on the first graph on your left, that's from 2023 this year to the end of November of this year, the beginning of January to November. Japan, of course, has lost about 14% against the US dollar in that time period. Malaysia and Thailand each around 6 to 8% as well. So currencies haven't performed well because the US Fed rate is so high. But moving on to next year, and that's our forecast, you can see if you look at the countries at the bottom there, Indonesia, South Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia, all expected to appreciate against the US dollar. So that graph that I showed you on the slide before with interest rates, as soon as that starts to come down, we do expect some currency movement to be favorable for countries in Southeast Asia. And so now let's move away from short-term trends to a bit of these longer-term trends. So things that you should be thinking about, say, in the next 3 to 5 years. And this is a graph that my chief economist asked me to put out all the time, and it's really, really complicated, but he makes me do it. But it does tell a pretty good story, and so let me just take 2 minutes to explain it. On the left-hand side, so on the vertical axis, that's GDP, right? So the higher you are up on there, the richer you are. And on the bottom axis, that's population. So the more you move to the right, the bigger a country you are. And then you see those dotted lines. There are 4 of those dotted lines that go kind of diagonally across. That represents a certain stage of growth, right? So the bottom dotted line is China's economy in 2010. The one just above that is China's economies now. And then the one above that is China's economies in 2040. So that's where China's economy is going. And so you can see from where the other countries are compared to China in those different periods. And then the top line is where the US economy is now. So the way to read this is that, look at that blue line that has the initials BD. That's Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is growing probably the fastest in the whole of the APEC region. And by 2040, Bangladesh will become as rich as China in 2010. So it reaches that bottom dotted line. You can see that Vietnam and Philippines, the orange and the yellow lines, they will become richer than China in 2010, but not quite as rich as China now. So these are sort of long, medium-term trends. And then you can see that some countries will also age, right? So if you look at Korea, which is that light green line, you can see that it starts to slope towards the left, which means that its population is starting to decline. So Korea will become slightly richer, but its population will decline, same as Germany, same as Japan. And then China, you can see all the way on the right there, where it will end up, and we think just below where the US will be. So this gives you kind of a snapshot of where countries are progressing in terms of population and GDP per capita in 2040. Then I have a couple of slides that kind of add to this story, right? We have, in Asia, we are used to the phrase new and aging tigers. And so what I have here is a bunch of lines that look at labor force growth in Asia until 2040, so the same time period as the previous slide. And so, not very surprising, some of this, right? If you look at the bottom line, the green line and the black line, that's China and that's Korea. Their labor force is going to decline. The Korean government just a couple of days ago said that it might decline and take away almost 5% of contribution to GDP. And that's just demographics, right? So that's things that we kind of know will happen. And then you see some of the other Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam and Indonesia all having labor forces growing. But the point that I want to make here is that even for Indonesia, which you can see in that light gray line, which has a spike, and India as well, in that dark blue line, that demographic transition, which I think Hari referred to as well, that is not as long as we think. It's a relatively short window for some of these countries to take advantage of their demographic transition and their addition to the labor force. So, immigration will become a much bigger issue, especially because of climate change. That will also change political systems. But let's not take the demographic transition for granted and assume that it will happen and that countries in Southeast Asia will be able to take advantage of it. And then urbanization, which I feel will all of you will know much more about than I do, but I decided to put some figures on urbanization in Asia to show that it still has a long way to run. So this is the level of urbanization. So you can see Japan in red and Australia in black and Korea on top, all levels of urbanization above 80%, but even in those countries, urbanization is still happening, right? It's happening at a much slower pace, but it is still happening. And then look at China. China is that blue line that is around the 60% mark. Now they say that Rome wasn't built in a day, but from 2005 to 2012, China built a city the size of Rome every 2 weeks. That's how fast urbanization was in China. And you can see that even with that pace of growth, China still has a fair amount of urbanization to go. So you can see the slope of China still proceeding. Cities are still being built there. And of course, the region that we are in, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, slightly lower, so that urbanization is still going to take place, still running at a pretty good clip. I think Malaysia is quite interesting here. If you look at Malaysia, that's the orange line just below Korea. And Malaysia is a bit more urbanized than its developmental stage suggests, right? So it's kind of run ahead of the urbanization curve. Now, one thing to put here is that, when we talk about, say, smart cities or climate change and adaptation, some of the older urbanized areas like Japan and Korea, of course, these are richer economies, and so they can afford a lot of these, but they also have legacy systems, right? And so when you think about these newer and younger cities, there are opportunities for leapfrogging. They don't have all of that legacy infrastructure, and they might be able to build things faster when it comes to some of these new technologies. Of course, financing is one of the big issues in these developing economies that might not help that. And so all of that then comes to these trends, these medium-term trends, add to the rise of the middle class. And of course, the middle class also means a lot more consumption, and they drive your GDP growth. And so what I put here was emerging Asia's expanding middle class over the next 4 years. So we have 3 dots there on the graph on the left, right? The red one is the middle class in 2023, the blue is 2025, and then yellow is 2027. And when I put this together, I was a bit surprised because Thailand actually in the next 4 years will see the biggest growth in the middle class of many of the Asia Pacific cities. And that's because of the new governments and some of the policies that they are enacting, raising the minimum wage, putting more money into the pockets of a lot of the people that live here. And so, you get that 9.6 figure, which is the expansion over the next 4 years. So that's good. That's good for consumption. But also in Thailand, one of the highest levels of household debt in Southeast Asia, if not the highest. And a lot of that debt is actually held by the younger demographic, which tends to mean that it will be there for a much longer time. And so, putting that into context, you look at Indonesia, that bubble is only 4%. So Indonesia's middle class not expanding at such a fast rate. But also Indonesia this year, earlier in the year, they removed some petrol subsidies, they removed some critical subsidies from the population, which meant that there's less disposable income. That 4.0 figure in expansion is, as a consequence, probably more sustainable, right? So the rise in the middle class, Indonesia at a lower clip, but could rise for a much longer time. So now let's look at some geo-economic trends, things that are reshaping supply chains. We talk a lot about de-risking and nearshoring and friendshoring. The US-China rivalry in Southeast Asia, this is one of the big theaters for that, right? We see that competition. Our governments are very used to balancing both of these countries. And over the last few years, especially post-pandemic, regulations and geopolitics has been driving supply chains to be shifting. The other one is that FDI flows have become and will become more diversified. A lot of that FDI used to flow into China, and now some of that is flowing into ASEAN and into India as well, and I have a great slide on that. But in the same time, shifts will be gradual, right? Nobody is packing up and leaving from China, even though we hear this China plus one rhetoric a lot more. China is still very, very important and the sole source of a lot of different types of manufacturing activity. And then governments now, I think especially, and companies as well, especially because of the high interest rates, are no longer choosing to supply things, and try to get that ever-expanding delta that is cheaper, because interest rates are just much higher. So they are decision matrix now includes choosing security over efficiency. And so now looking at Asia, I think when we think about the US-China rivalry, sometimes it's described as China for economic prosperity and the US for security. And I think that binary is probably a very lazy way to look at it. So I have some figures here. That chart looks at FDI inflows into ASEAN from 2012 and 2022. So that blue line on top shows you that FDI has just increased over the last 10 years. Not very surprising. But that light blue line just below is US FDI into the region. And in 2022, the US was actually the biggest source of FDI into the ASEAN region. And then if you look at that red one, which is the EU, in 2012 is pretty small. And in 2022, you can see that it expanded by almost 3 or 3.5 times. So the EU also pushing a lot more money into ASEAN. And part of this is the consequence of governments and companies thinking about China. And so this is my favorite slide, who wins from the unraveling of Sino-American trade. We had this made in China tariffs in 2015 that the Trump administration continued that with a whole slew of tariffs as well. And then the Biden administration did the same thing. And so, when the Trump administration started this, they thought the biggest beneficiary of all of these tariffs would be Latin America and perhaps some parts of the Middle East and North Africa. But if you look at this chart on your right here, this is exports to the US from 2018 to 2022. And you can see, look, Cambodia, 240% increase. Vietnam, 160% increase. Laos, Bangladesh, Thailand, all above 50%. Indonesia and India, all around 50% as well. So The countries that have really been exporting to the US and have benefited from these supply chain shifts have been countries in our region, and that will continue. But the caveat is these little dots on the right of that graph, right? So Cambodia, yes, 240%, but look, it's about a rounding error in terms of its share of US imports, right? Only 0.4%. Vietnam has a very large share, 4%. It's very considerable in Thailand, in Indonesia, and India. But look at China, it's still 17% of imports into the US. So despite all of this diplomatic rhetoric and spy balloons flowing and congressional visits to Taiwan and things like that, the numbers when it comes to trade shows a very strong relationship between the US. Both administrations will probably change that, so that will start coming down. But I think we need to remove some of the cognitive dissonance between the geopolitics and the actual trade. And then very quickly, some Southeast Asian economies, when we are shifting, will be able to absorb some of these FDI, but there is a limit, right? And so this is our business environment rankings, and I wanted to direct your attention to the infrastructure category, which is third from the right. And you can see on the bottom there, I've circled a whole bunch of reds, right? So red is not so good. And the point I want to make here is that yes, FDI is flowing into the ASEAN region, but there's a limit to how much we can absorb because of certain structural factors. Infrastructure is one of them. Vietnam has been the darling of a lot of investments. The economy has been growing very, very well, but Vietnam has only 20% of its roads that are paved, and it has a ratio of secondary roads to primary roads of about 2-to-1. In most developed economies, it's about 1-to-1. So, there is some limit to how much you can absorb, and building out infrastructure is not a quick fix, right? It takes time to build all of those things. And this is the reason here, this slide, why we'll be talking about US-China rivalry for the next 10 years at least, right? So here's a share of global manufacturing output. You can see Japan and Korea on the bottom there in dark and light blue. And so over the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2020, their share has been around 10%. You can see some of those countries that have started to really push their manufacturing on top in India, Bangladesh, Indonesia. On the top of that graph, their share has increased. But then look at the contribution of China, which is in yellow. It's just massive, and it dwarfs all of the other manufacturing from the other region. And so China still, when you call it the factory of the world, here are some figures that kind of prove the case. All right, now I need you to do something, right? So you guys are gonna do some work. I'm gonna give you a little bit of a quiz on generative AI. And what I have is 2 slides, so you can see them. It's this one. If I can get it back, yeah. And this one. And so read this slide and then read the next one. I'll give you 10 seconds and tell me which one you think ChatGPT wrote and which one you think I wrote, right? So this is the first one. The input was the future of financial services. Take about 10 seconds, 3 bullet points. I put a nice little photo there that is also AI generated. So just take a quick look at that. I'll go to the next one now. 4 bullet points. I made the bullet points a bit bigger. Same photo, same prompt. Give you another 5 seconds. So now, show of hands. How many of you, this is the first one, how many of you think ChatGPT wrote this one? We got 1, we got 2, all right. How many of you think ChatGPT wrote this one? So it's overwhelming number of people that think ChatGPT wrote this one. And I'm very sorry to say, but it was a trick question. ChatGPT wrote both of them, right? And what I did was for the first one, I put in my previous slides and it came up with that and told it to write it in that style. And then for the second one, it just did what it did, right? With the same very simple prompt. And I use that to say that it's very difficult to tell what the difference is between generative AI developed content and content that a human produces, right? And this was a very sort of frivolous example, but you can imagine the examples when it comes to things like elections or other things that are much more important. Over the past year, artificial intelligence has really, really taken off, and we haven't been able to stop talking about it. I think this is the year where two things will happen. There'll be much more adoption, so that's where implementation comes in. You know, people talk about marketing, about customer dealing with customers, and about research and development. A survey by McKinsey said those were the 3 top users. But that same survey also said that outside of the tech industry, only about 1/3 of companies and managers were really keen on figuring out how to use AI. So I think that the hype is very, very high. The ability to use it is less. Part of that is capacity. You know, do you have the correct talent to use it? Part of that is, fear about copyright or regulatory infringement. So I think this year will be very interesting in terms of how AI is adopted. I do think adoption will be quite good, but sort of a much less than the hype that we have experienced over the past year. So now just a couple of things that I want to say about next year, right? One is Votorama, right? So here is a slide of all the countries that are going to vote, and the bigger the bubble, the bigger the number of people live in those countries. And on the right-hand side are democracies, and on the left-hand side, as you go from red to sort of that gray or black color, are authoritarian regimes. And so next year, about 4.2 billion people will live in countries that will vote. So less people actually vote than that. And 8 out of the 10 biggest countries will be voting next year. So you have India, you have the US, you have Brazil. In our region, you have Indonesia as well. Not all of the big economies or big voting blocks are important. We also have Taiwan in January. That will be a very important election in terms of US-China relations and China's relations with Taiwan. We also have elections in the US, which will be extremely important, and elections in the EU, where there have been a whole bunch. Immigration this year is around 1 million asylum seekers into the EU, which hasn't been at that level since 2015, 2016. That might cause a bit of a shift to the right or more populist type politics there. So lots of things to see in terms of election. We've never seen such elections at this scale ever. And then America's global choice, right? So right now we have 2 rather unpopular candidates in the US, right? So President Biden's approval ratings are around 60%. When polled, only about 65% of people say that they want President Trump to run again. And so you have these 2 unpopular candidates. It doesn't seem that anyone else will come in and compete with them. You also have this very curious and unprecedented case where Donald Trump, when he runs, will probably be facing about 98 criminal charges across 4 different cases. And his modus is, of course, to use this to energize his base and sort of delay any kind of verdict through legal means. So you could face a president that is in an election season facing an incumbent, facing a challenger that is going through all of these legal troubles. But we now put a 1 in 3 chance of Donald Trump winning, so I think it's useful to think about what that means for the world. Whatever the case, the US president next year will face a whole bunch of things in their in-tray that are very, very difficult. Social Security and Medicare are running out of money. We have nuclear proliferation, Iran and North Korea on the table as well. We have the situation with Taiwan as well. And so, wars in the Middle East also distracting the US. So a very, very key time, and so it's very hard to underestimate the importance of the US election. And quite strangely, you see the shadow of Donald Trump sort of in the center there. The US presidential elections are usually quite close, and it could come down to 6 states where his shadow is, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arkansas, about 50 million people, which is bigger than Spain but less than Italy, could choose the next American president that will have really global consequences. And I'm running out of time, so I'll just do one more on new energy geography. We've talked a lot about sustainability. I think that will be in the discussion for the rest of the day as well. But as we move to net zero, it will take a lot of things, right? It'll take a lot of fossil fuels and it'll take a lot of digging new minerals out of the ground. And if we go there on that journey, one thing is that any country that produces fossil fuels now and that can dig it out cheap and sell it expensive will have massive influence, right? So Saudi Arabia, UAE will still be there. But also, tiny Guyana has just discovered oil reserves of around 1.1% of the global reserves, which could mean that it will produce more oil per capita than any other country in the world. And then you look at all of the stuff that we need for the green transition, things like lithium and nickel. For lithium, Australia and China are big players, but also in that other category as well, they found more deposits in different countries. Iran has also found one of the big deposits of lithium, apparently the second biggest. So, these things might change where new energy geography powers are. Nickel also is used in a lot of battery technology. And of course, Indonesia and Australia have they share the biggest amount of nickel deposits. Nickel is also used to make cobalt. And New Caledonia has 7% of nickel deposits in the world, with a population of only 300,000. So going forward, as we move to 2050 and we are doing this new energy transition, more players will become important and will shift from fossil fuel kind of dominance to a mixed dominance of countries that produce it and produce all of these new types of minerals that are needed. And with that, I'll thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Thank you very much.